Zdravstvuyja. Apologies to any Russian speakers out there. That was my greeting to episode 3 of the Soviet Union vlog, which this time is going to look at Lenin's economic policies. We're going to consider what those policies were, why they changed so often, and of course, linked in with that, how successful or unsuccessful they are. But also, bear in mind that these policies very much overlap and fit alongside the growing centralization of Lenin's government. So, Lenin's initial economic policy is called state capitalism, and this lasts for the first 9 months of the Bolsheviks being in power. It really reflects their weak position at the start. 2 decrees were passed almost straight away. The decree on land, which gave land to peasants, like the Bolsheviks, could stop the peasants grabbing all the land for themselves anyway. And the decree on workers' control, which was a bit more ideological in the sense that it gave control of industrial enterprises, factories, to the workers themselves. And this was very ideological in the sense there was not going to be any hierarchy anymore in those factories, that the workers themselves would determine when they worked, how much they worked, how much they got paid. And you don't have to be a genius to work out that neither of these policies worked all that well in the medium term. I should say as well that the other thing that they did right at the start was to introduce, again, very ideologically, a body called Veshenka, Vesenkha. And this body, Veshenka, outlasts the state capitalism policy itself. It was there to plan the economy, and it also led to the nationalisation of banks and railways. But on the whole, state capitalism wasn't a success. It probably wouldn't have been a success anyway, but certainly in the context of the Civil War, the situation became serious. And so Lenin introduced a second policy called war communism. And this, as it says really in the title, was to cope with the problems that were posed by the Civil War, and was very much a tightening of the ideological but also practical grip upon the economy. So in war communism, all industries were nationalised and they were going to be controlled by Veshenka, that they were going to be run by managers, and discipline would be brought back in. You could be fined for being late or being absent. And crucially as well, from August 1918, grain was going to be forcibly requisitioned from the peasants. In fact, there was instructions about this which said that each group that went out needed to take at least 2 or 3 machine guns with it in order to get this grain that the peasants were hanging on to and bring it back in to the urban areas. However, the war communism policy also had a fairly poor record. For several reasons, some of them economic and some of them a bit more ideological and political. And firstly, during the Civil War, and understandably, military needs were given priority. And this meant, of course, that supply chains were disrupted for factories, and the workforce was restricted as well, partly by conscription, people being called up to fight in the Red Army to win the Civil War, but also by people leaving the cities in search of food or to escape that fighting. For example, the populations of both Moscow and Petrograd fell by half in the period 1918 to 21. Hyperinflation was also a problem under war communism, and this is a particular problem for industry who are trying to buy and sell goods. Because of the limits of goods, the supply of money was already increased, and the government kept printing money as well through this period, eventually meaning that money was actually abolished completely. All this meant that the index of gross industrial output, a measure of everything that's being made in Russia at this time, dropped from 100, so the index is always out of 100 in 1913, down to 31 in 1921. As a more concrete example, electricity output in 1913 was 2,039 million kilowatts, but only 520 in 1921, so down to about a quarter of what it had been before the First World War. And coal, 29 million tonnes had been mined in 1913, just before the First World War, only 9 million in 1921. So war communism was not a system that worked well economically, perhaps because of the situation of the country at the time, but it also wasn't providing the motivation or it didn't have the infrastructure in order to do better. And this impacted, or seen most clearly, perhaps in food production. And the food harvests in 1920-21 were less than half of that gathered in 1913. The government, of course, blamed the kulaks, the rich peasants, falsely. But inevitably, this led to famine where millions of Soviet citizens died. Um, certainly millions. And the figures vary quite a lot on this. So 5 million is the lowest I've seen. 20 million is about the biggest I've seen. But millions, perhaps tens of millions. The situation was so bad that even Pravda, the Soviet state newspaper, admitted that 1 in 5 Russians were starving. And although they blamed kulaks and the whites in the Civil War, again, it got so bad that the Bolsheviks accepted aid from foreign nations, mostly from America. The American Relief Association provided food enough for 10 million Russians. So the impact of the war, but also of the grain requisitioning policy from war communism, actually seems to have worked counter to what they were hoping. They were hoping to get more grain into the cities, but it seems to have destroyed motivation and morale amongst the peasantry and resulted in fewer crops being sown and planted, and then much fewer being harvested. All of this, the famine, the poor harvests, and of course the draconian policies, led to risings in grain areas in the Volga Basin, in the North Caucasus, and Western Siberia, where 60,000 were involved. And most famously in Tambov. The Tambov rising in central Russia took 50,000 Red Army troops to suppress in 1921. This was tricky for the government, who were trying to set themselves up as being the government of the whole of Russia. Um, but it was manageable in the sense that these people were kind of opposed to communism anyway. Worse for Lenin and his party were the workers' opposition group, which was set up within the Communist Party by Alexandre Kollontai and Alexander Shlapnikov. And they were campaigning for economic change on the basis that they said the party leaders, their own party leaders, had lost touch with the proletariat. And this is a massively serious charge for any communist, but the proletariat, the people they are meant to be serving. This was then made extremely serious in March 1921 by the Kronstadt Rising in the Kronstadt naval base. This was suppressed by Marshal Cherkivsky, but Lenin said later on that this rising had lit up reality like a flash of lightning. These people were the Kronstadt sailors, and some workers that had joined them were against war communism. They were against special food rations for party members, but also, more seriously, they were in favour of new Soviet elections by secret ballot. In other words, they wanted the Communist Party to be at least challenged and possibly removed from power. They wanted the release of left-wing political prisoners. Ditto. They wanted the Communist Party's influence reduced and perhaps removed. And they were in favour of freedom of speech, freedom of press, and freedom of assembly. The reason this was so serious was that the sailors of the Kronstadt naval base had been people who had supported the Bolsheviks in their initial revolution and were seen as the core group that were backing and pushing forward and helping reinforce the revolution. So not only was there opposition, small-scale opposition within the party, but also this serious opposition outside the party. Now, the Kronstadt Rising was suppressed brutally. Lots of heavy fighting, and then leaders were shot afterwards and others were hunted down. But it did help change Lenin's mind. And Lenin, in 1921, did two things that are important. The second one was to introduce the NEP. But the first one that we've mentioned before is that he brought in the ban on factions. And this was within the party, and it said essentially that there can be some debate, but there can't be factions. You have to agree with what the party leaders say. And this, of course, is exploited massively by Stalin in the coming years. But at this time, it was to try and ensure party unity over what was going to be a really controversial step. That controversial step was the NEP. Lenin said this was one step backwards, two steps forwards. He also said that the NEP was to let the peasants have their little bit of capitalism so that the communists could keep power. This was, though, controversial. Trotsky said it was the first sign of the degeneration of Bolshevism. The reason it was controversial was because, it ended grain requisition. That's not so controversial. But instead, it introduced a tax in kind on grain. And crucially, it said that the peasants could sell their surplus grain after they'd been taxed for a profit, so that they could use that money for themselves however they wanted. Larger industries were going to stay nationalised, but they had to budget for purchase of materials and pay their wages. They couldn't just rely upon handouts from government. And again, crucially, small industries were returned to private ownership and could be run to make a profit. So this was the new economic policy introduced in 1921, and it was in essence where war communism was very communist, very ideological, but actually quite brutal and didn't work. The NEP was, as Lenin said, a step backwards to introduce a measure of capitalism into the system. Still, 85% of the industrial workforce were state controlled. But from now on, 75% of trade was conducted by what were called NEP men, NEP men, who were essentially, they were traders who were trading, getting stuff from the local village markets and bringing it to town to sell it, and perhaps passing on goods, selling stuff back to the villages, all for a profit. These are merchants in the capitalist sense. This was done primarily to provide grain and to settle the country down. And actually, it kind of worked. Grain production in 1923 was 57 million tonnes, which was almost 20 million tonnes up on where it had been in 1921. But actually, and by 1926, more land was being sown than it had been before the war. But in 1923, they were still 25 million tonnes behind where they had been in 1913. Similar story in industry. The value of factory output doubled between 1923 and 21. I know it's backwards, but in 2 years. And the average wage of urban workers rose by 50% in the same time, 1921 to 23. But although all the figures, if you look across them, coal, steel, electricity, are significantly better in 1923 than 21, they're still, again, lagging quite a long way behind 1913, the first year before disruption and dislocation before the First World War. It's not until 1926 that they start to recover to that point. So it's very much a mixed bag in terms of the NEP as to whether it was worth it. They had betrayed communist ideology and split the party. The communists don't like the idea of the capitalist elements of it, and they didn't like things like nightclubs and casinos. But it did provide a measure of economic stability, and for a short while, it provided a step forward for the Soviets. So there we are. There's Lenin's economic policies, changing from really, I guess, getting less ideological at each step and becoming more pragmatic, practical, doing what needs to be done. But also alongside that, you can see where they're trying to take control of the country, firstly by force, and then through the ban on factions, controlling the party and stopping conversation with that, but also using slightly more sophisticated methods of trying to motivate people through the NEP and ensure that they're on side through allowing them to prosper. I hope that's helpful. We'll pick up on this sort of stuff when we look at Stalin's economic policy in a future vlog. See you then.